All right, I think that's our cue to begin. So thank you to all of you for taking time out of your very busy workday to join us for this webinar. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to speak to you about a topic that is so important. I personally have a love-hate relationship with feedback, both giving and getting. It often feels like no matter what we do or say, our learners never feel like it's enough, and what we get in return is often unhelpful. So we're here to help you change that today. Our talk today is entitled, Tell Me What You Really Think, How to Provide Real-Time Feedback to Learners and Obtain Honest Feedback in Return. Our running theme for the hour will be growth. So we hope that you can pick up a few tips today to help you grow regardless of where you are starting from in your feedback journey. My name is Stephanie Catanese. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at Brown University and an associate program director for the general internal medicine residency program. And I'm going to pass the mic to my co-presenters to let them introduce themselves, and then we can begin. So we'll start with Hussein.
Thank you, Steph. I'm Hussein Khwaja. I'm one of the assistant program directors for Brown Internal Medicine residency. I also have a little bit of role in UME, and I'm the site director, and I'm an associate professor of medicine. Like Steph, I also have interest and love-hate relationship with feedback, especially when it comes to faculty development as well as that of our learners. So I'm excited to be here. I'm going to pass it on to Missy now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Missy McNeil. I'm a professor of medicine at Brown, and I'm the old lady of the group with 40 years of experience as a clinician educator. And I love feedback. I love giving it. I love getting it. And so we are just thrilled today to be able to share with you some of the strategies that we use that sort of deal with that ambivalence about feedback. So our objectives for the hour. First, to describe the culture of error, including the benefits of real-time feedback. Second is to employ strategies for soliciting feedback from learners. And the third is to illustrate a framework for how to process feedback from learners. And I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about how you set the stage for giving feedback in a way that feels positive and not punitive. So we're going to talk, and one of the things I want to really emphasize is what we want to talk a lot about today is giving feedback in real time. Your learner presents to you, your learner answers a question. Things aren't quite as they should be. How do you go about fixing that? So the first thing to emphasize is what we're really talking about here is formative feedback. And just so that we're all on the same page, formative feedback is used to help the individual improve performance. It should include both what needs to be improved and how to do it. This is different than summative feedback. You know, our learners tend to link feedback with grades, and that's a summative feedback. Summative feedback is used for judgments or decisions, certification of performance, grades, promotions. And today we're going to talk about formative feedback. And one of the first ways to ensure that your learners are receptive is to tell them that you will be giving feedback along the way, not just feedback Friday or end of the rotation feedback. So I'd like to ask you guys in the chat to reflect on times when you have received feedback. When was it helpful? When was it not useful? And what made it go well? And if you guys would just indulge us here by throwing a few thoughts in the chat about any of those questions.
Missy, I will look at the chat for you.
All righty, I have it up, Hussein. So at least for right now, I can.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So Craig says, more helpful if it's timely, specific, and based on expectations. I love it. When only summative, it's too late. You can't make a change. Love that too. Again, the importance of formative. Sue adds for us that near in time to the occurrence, but not enough space to be overwhelming. Interesting. Inviting self-assessment is always helpful. We'll talk about that, Ravi. Karina says feedback is only valuable when it is honest and not sugar-coated. Oh, love that one. And we'll talk about that. Ryan tells us that it's helpful when directed to an individual and not just feedback for the group, which gets to the comment about it being specific. So you guys are all over this. This is exactly where we want to go. So I will ask you then, what is your go-to mode when you give feedback in the clinical setting? And that can be, and we're talking about on wards, either on walk rounds, in attending rounds where you're sitting down, maybe precepting in clinic. And the options are here in real time. So if you're on rounds and the learner does something that could be better, you give feedback sort of in real time. Do you do it after the encounter? Do you always do it in private, or are you comfortable doing it in front of the group? And one of the last comments was giving it in front of the group can be helpful to everybody. But the question is then, is it specific? So what do you guys think? After the encounter, if debriefing an encounter, okay. E, all the above, I love it. Gabrielle says, I give feedback in real time during the patient presentation. If the feedback is specific, I do it in private, okay? And Gabrielle, can I ask what you mean by that? If maybe just unmute for a second. Jill, can he unmute? I hope.
So if I see that the learner it's going to be very negative feedback, I'll do that in private, as opposed to in front of everyone.
Okay, all right. So it's interesting. What is negative, right? I mean, negative is an interesting word, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Ryan comments, real time typically necessitates it in front of the group, and that is true. And you will see where we're going here. Dimitri says real time, but always in private, which actually sort of implies that it's actually maybe not real time, but close time, if you will. All right. So setting the stage for thinking. So last thing I want to ask you before we share our thoughts about this is, are there difficulties that you have encountered in giving real-time feedback to learners? Why do you not give feedback to learners in real time? Because as Ryan says, real time necessitates in front of the group. What are your barriers? We don't want them to feel attacked. We don't have time at the time of the interaction. Okay. So how the learner feels about it. Worried about time. Anybody else? Focusing on the process and the product and not the individual seems to help. So trying to make it so if I can paraphrase, specific but general at the same time. When I see this is what I think, something like that. Fear it might impact the learning environment. Exactly. Okay, great. And then negative emotional response, sensitive issues, time, space, feedback versus style. And then Ashley comments, picking the opportunities. And I'm going to agree with everything everybody said, but in particular, sort of focusing on Ashley, I think there are opportunities for real-time feedback that won't encounter those negative consequences as long as we are thoughtful. So the common concerns that people talk about, it takes too long. It destroys the learning climate. One thing you guys didn't comment on, but people talk about all the time, is does it erode the relationship between learner and patient, especially if you're doing it at the bedside on walk rounds. And then the fear that it can't be specific enough. But all of these can be managed. So we really want you to walk with us through how we've approached it. So there are some specific benefits of giving real-time feedback. And by that, I mean, you ask the learner a question or they perform for you in some way, and you do a timeout and give them feedback. The biggest benefit is that it gets done. You mean to do it after walk rounds, you mean to do it after the small group session of attending rounds, but actually you get a page, your learner gets taken away by a family crisis or something going on. And so then it doesn't get done in close proximity and it can slip away before you know it. The other benefit is that it can be much more specific. If you tell a learner, for example, that their summary statement is too long, and you do it right after they give you a summary statement, they know exactly what you're referring to. It also offers an opportunity for a redo and the practice of skills you're trying to teach. So I really like the summary statement. That's one of my important skills of clinical reasoning that I teach. And so if somebody gives me a really long summary statement with too much past medical history and the sort of, we all talk about the dialogue approach, the diary approach. They came in, they had a fever. This is day 4. They came in, they had a fever. We got blood cultures, and it turned out they had gram-positive cocci, which turned out to be staph. The summary statement really should be, gentlemen here with staph bacteremia. So I can offer them the opportunity for a redo right at the moment. The learner gets better in real time and everyone learns.
Oh, look. Huh.
Is that the one that you need to see?
Yeah, I mean, this is like, I can just lower it here. I can see like a little, it's just like a lecture on, I can just look at
Please,
this.
do you want to mute yourself, please?
Dr. Benavides is his name.
Oh yeah, I'll just tell them I'm logged in as, oh really? Oh, because that's the computer.
It shows as Dr. Benavides.
Is that okay? Or should I log in with my?
Luis.
Yeah, I'll just tell her.
All right, skills for giving
Yeah, I'm
feedback in
logged
real
under-
time. There are 2 key skills
under-
that tried, Jamie. Love it. There are 2 key skills that I want to emphasize today about how you set the stage for giving feedback in real time. You know, we talked a little bit about, you know, how you make feedback go well, and some of it is that the feedback should match the expectations you give. So one of the expectations I give is that I'm going to give feedback in real time. And it's what we call a rollout speech. Hi guys, I'm Dr. McNeil. You're going to be working with me today on the wards. And, you know, let me just tell you that it's really important for me that I help take you from good to great. And so in order to do that, I'm going to give everybody feedback in real time. It's not personal. It's because I want you to be fabulous, and we're going to work it through together. The second is creating what we call a culture of error. So again, the rollout speech is about setting expectations. And the goal here is to create a positive classroom so that everybody expects the feedback in real time and is not taken aback by it. So I give feedback in real time. I do it to everyone. My goal is to make you better. I will share both good and corrective feedback. So notice I don't use the word negative. I use the word corrective. Maybe a semantic issue, but I think it makes a difference. No one is surprised then when I give feedback. My expectations are clear, and it's not personal. It's my style. Everyone gets feedback, both good and bad. So this is a little tricky because you have to kind of think, you have to monitor yourself to keep your feedback balanced. You know, intern A may be much stronger than intern B, so it's easier to give intern A good feedback and intern B gets more corrective feedback, but you have to sort of be keeping at least a little bit of score in your brain. I give both reinforcing, and that was great. I love that summary statement. Susie, that summary statement's a little long. Try it again. And again, when somebody does something right, I will stop in the middle of the presentation and tell them, that was a great history of the present illness. I love the way you identified that problem. The second piece to this is, in addition to sort of setting expectation, is the concept of creating a culture of error. And by this, we really mean sort of trying to facilitate a growth mindset. By normalizing error, you make error something that is desirable because you only learn from error. I point out to my learners that if they never fail, they are not pushing themselves and are not improving as fast as you could. I want you to struggle. I want to know where you're struggling. I want to know where they are stuck. And in fact, when they come to a pause and they don't know where to go, I will actually ask, where are you stuck? Explain to me what it is that's stopping you from going to the next step. And then finally, that we, our communications gurus would tell us when we talk to patients and we want to know if patients have understood what we've said, we should ask, what questions do you have? Not, do you have any questions? Because the what questions do you have is more of an invitation and implies that there should be questions. And that's exactly what we want to do with our learners. We want them to feel that actually knowing where they're stuck, being able to articulate where they're stuck, getting help to get unstuck is a fabulous thing. It is a gift. All feedback is a gift. And we try very hard to create that environment. So plan for errors, set the stage, use what we call normalizing language. And frankly, if you take nothing away from my part of the talk, I would like you to think about these 3 little bullet points. I find them incredibly helpful. Somebody says something that's not right, I will say, I'm so glad you said that. It's one of the most common mistakes people make when they're learning about hyponatremia. And now we can talk about it. Sometimes I say, you're 80% of the way there, right? That gives positive feedback for being close, but you're not really 100%. So therefore, you're 80% of the way there. Can anybody bring us home? Sometimes I say, you're 20% of the way there. Sometimes I say, thanks for getting us started. So if we're really not very much along the way there, but I do reward people for being willing to participate. Again, remember, you want a role model that we make errors too as attendings. You just did what I did when I first learned about whatever. And certainly if you learn something or something, you make a mistake in your thinking or your clinical reasoning and you learn about it, you learn some new information, own it. Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. It's amazing. And what I really also want you to remember that right is right. We tend to do what we call round up with our learners. They give us sort of a close answer and we kind of let it sit. We don't really correct it. We're not precise. That is really problematic. And it's problematic to say things, you want to be encouraging and supportive. That's okay. It's really a hard one. You did your best. But that can be dangerous if you don't go on to correct it and get people to the right place. The dangers of not giving real-time feedback is that it communicates lower expectations and it sends the message that errors in feedback are something to be apologized for and best avoided rather than growth opportunities. So my take-home message is, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Set clear expectations, practice your rollout speech and be consistent, be warm, be direct, but get past nice and make errors and the correction of errors a normal part of practice. And if you work at it and you're even-handed, do it in real time, give positive, reinforcing, and corrective feedback, it will be well perceived, I promise you. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Missy. So I am going to take us to the second part of the talk. It's going to be the flip side of the coin of feedback. So Missy talked about normalizing the culture of error and talking about tips about like giving feedback to your learners. The other side is how do you actually receive and get feedback from your learners. So I'm hopeful that my part of the talk, I will be able to come up, help you give some tips and strategies for soliciting feedback from your learners. So before we begin, if you don't mind doing the same thing again for me for the next 30 seconds or so, what barriers do you face when you're soliciting feedback from your learners? Or if you don't do it, that's fine to write as well, that I don't solicit feedback from my learners. That would mean you're in the right place. So worried about grades for students, worried about relationships with residents. The generic all was good. Getting that. Power dynamic, that's excellent. Hesitant to say anything critical or negative, that's excellent. Don't get honest answers, I'm assuming, for areas for improvement, no specifics. So I think that's pretty much in line with what probably all of us have experienced. They're hesitant to give any critique. I think that's great. That's exactly why we decided to cover this part of the talk as well. So I'm hoping this is going to be helpful. I love this saying, Mark Twain, supposing is good, but finding out is better. So let's find out what we're doing and how we can get ourselves better. I'm hoping we're talking a lot about feedback. We are talking about giving feedback, how to solicit feedback, and then Steph is going to talk about how to receive that feedback, that all of us will leave this hour as feedback monsters and do more and more of it. So I think one thing I want to start off, you may not think of yourself as an intimidating person. I'm like friendly with the residents and I'm good with the medical students, but just always know, and I think some of you have already identified that with the answers you gave in the chat, that your role as the boss on the team is intimidating to the learners. So you could get feedback, but most likely what you're going to get is either something non-specific, or there's a high chance of getting just like plain old flattery, and which unfortunately at times can be just false flattery. I might be preaching to the choir here, but I think it's important to remind ourselves why it is important to get feedback as a teacher or as a boss. The first natural thing is to improve our skills as a teacher, and then you pay it forward, and that helps aid the progress of our learners and our students. So that's why we do it. I love this quote from this book, Thanks for the Feedback, by Douglas Stone and Sheila Heen. They found out that people who go out and solicit negative feedback, like actively looking for it, meaning they're not just fishing for compliments, they report higher satisfaction. Why? Because they actually adapt more quickly to new roles, they get higher performance reviews, and they show others that they're committed to doing their jobs. And I think one other thing as a reminder, that soliciting feedback is different from soliciting approval. It might hurt, but it's important for our own growth. So the first thing we have to do is to do it right is to set the tone. So one thing I will say is always say thank you. Explain how you will respond to the feedback before you even ask for it. And that could be, I will refer to that rollout speech that Missy talked about, and that's where it could be a part of your rollout speech. When you're talking about that, I will be giving you feedback, it's a nice point in time to mention that I would like some, I'm going to solicit feedback from you, so I'd like feedback from you as well. So tell them how you're going to respond to it. Be persistent in asking for it, and then reward the candor. So it's not sufficient to just appreciate critique from your learners or not to get defensive. You have to take the next step, and when it's possible, make visible changes based on the feedback that you receive. Also, I recognize that change is hard, and if it is hard in certain situations or it requires more time, show them that you're working towards it. Also, I would say if you get feedback that you disagree with, it's criticism, try at least finding something that they have said that resonates with you, that you do agree with, and mention that as a starting point. Then offer maybe full and respectful explanations for why you disagree with their other comments. The other thing to think about is if you get annoyed or you're angry at the critique that you just received or the feedback that you got, don't get to explaining your point of view immediately. That will just break the whole trust cycle that you may have started with your team, with your learner. Instead, just say thank you, let them know that you're going to think about what they said, and then get back to them. I love this figure. I know it says negative, and we are trying to stay away from, we want to use the word corrective now, but I did not want to change the figure. But I want us to focus. I actually wanted to say, like, the left side of the figure is easy. So ignore. If you're getting inaccurate feedback, if it's negative, ignore it. If it's positive, that's the false flattery I was talking about. If you're in the top right corner, if you get positive feedback that's accurate, it's a moment for you to celebrate. But what I want us to focus on is the bottom right corner, where we actually learn things and use the things that we learn as a chance to learn and do better and make changes to our practice. Before we go to the next part of this section, I would like for I think somebody is saying they're not seeing the same thing I'm explaining. Are people not able to see the slides? Is there
This
more?
looks good for me.
I see the slides.
I
Okay.
see them.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So if people could put in the chat, what questions do you use to solicit feedback during your clinical teaching? So Ahmed says, I want to improve as well. What would you have liked me to do differently or better to help you learn more? That's excellent. Love it. I tell learners specific things I'm working on. That's great. So you're being specific and telling them what you are working on. So it gives them something to work on when they're giving you feedback. Anything else? I'm working on improving my teaching skills. What could I do differently? That's great. What should we do differently? That's great. So I think I'm getting that there's more people who are asking more specific questions. Terry says something great. She says, can you give me 2 suggestions for things I could have done better to teach you as a learner? I love that. I think that's even more specific. And I'll talk about that, what that means. That's saying that give me 2 things. Ryan says, giving summative feedback typically requires preparation. Often find that if residents are not ready for the question, they don't have much to say, which is, again, going back to what I said, I think part of the rollout speech, setting that expectation that I'm going to be looking for feedback as well. I asked them to write 3 things they liked and 3 they would like to change and adjust. That's awesome. I try to be specific with what I teach, what feedback on. Did I teach on pertinent topic on rounds? Did the flow of rounds keep an adequate balance of patients? These are all amazing. Perfect. I think most of you, all of you are on the right track, and I'm hoping that I can do a little bit more to get you there. Like Missy said, 80% of the way there. Let's get to 100%. All right, so I'm going to move to the next slide. Thank you, everyone. I want to start by the things that you should not do. I will be honest and say that I've actually asked these questions as expected, got nothing in response. And I was like, I'm doing something wrong because I'm not getting the answer that I'm looking for. So don't do this. Do you have any feedback for me? If people in the group are doing it, that's fine. But, you know, here's what we can learn, some tips and strategies. Or saying something about give me some feedback. It's too generic. I almost feel like you're almost asking for the conversation to actually close and end instead of actually opening it up for when you're looking for feedback. So 4 things when you're talking about approach to soliciting feedback: lead by example, create a supportive atmosphere, stick to specifics, and timing. Request it early and talk about it early in your interaction with your learners. So leading by example, I would say the lead by example starts when you are actually giving feedback to your learners. So you can act as a role model for them and you can give them a possible starting point. You can use that, the way you give feedback, use that as an opportunity to introduce non-judgmental language. It can serve as means to focus on behaviors as opposed to character traits. Again, you do that by role modeling and the way you offer feedback. And it demonstrates your openness to constructive criticism or corrective feedback. So creating a supportive atmosphere, I will say, I think it's this itself, the act of soliciting feedback, telling them that you care about getting their feedback. It contributes towards creating a supportive atmosphere. It shows to them that you care about creating a positive learning environment. And I've mentioned this before, I'm going to say it again, the rollout speech, practice it, include your want of soliciting feedback from your learners in your rollout speech. Warn them, prepare them. And I think that was one of the comments in the chat that they just get caught off guard. So this will hopefully help if you make it as a part of your rollout speech in the beginning of your interaction. Somebody mentioned something being more specific. So instead of saying something like, what did you think of my teaching physical exam skills on rounds? Saying something like, was there any way in which I might have made my demonstration of evaluation of JVP clearer? So you can see that it's even the first one, I feel like it seems specific enough that you're just talking about your physical exams teaching skills and not just about other ways you're conducting yourself in rounds or whatever. But this helps you become even more specific. It sounds like it was something you could have done in real time almost, like you taught JVP, how to evaluate for JVP on rounds, and then the same day you asked about that. The other thing this question shows is that you are looking for improvement and you feel like you're already telling them, I want to get better. How can I make myself better? Last thing is timing, and I cannot emphasize that enough, because I think this is what can become a barrier. Again, you don't want to catch them off guard. Make requests for soliciting feedback early. It gives them the message that their contributions and suggestions to your growth are expected and welcomed. Make explicit the goal for improvement, and when learners see that there's time to change, it can motivate them and make it easier for them to make suggestions. Again, if you keep making rapid cycle changes to your practice, you have enough time, if you do it early enough, to actually close the loop as well with them. And I'm going to give a few tips now, not on how to take a great selfie, but on how to solicit feedback from your learners. So I think the first thing I will say is embrace the discomfort. It is uncomfortable, especially when you're expecting and telling them I want to work on something, so they have to give you something corrective. So they will get uncomfortable, you will get uncomfortable. So once you ask for feedback, my advice would be to stop talking, count to 7, and commit to allowing the other person to speak first. When it is clear that you're not going to break the silence, they will speak up. If that doesn't work, ask them to come back to you the next day with some specific suggestions, and then make sure that you follow up on it. Make sure that you catch them again and ask for more feedback. The other big tip is listen with the intent to understand and not necessarily to respond. So don't interrupt or argue. I said that before as well. When someone gives you feedback, listen and focus on understanding the feedback and try to learn something from it. When they're finished speaking, check for understanding. So saying things like, so what I hear you saying is, do I have that right? I think sort of like the same things we do with our patients check when we check for understanding, when we explain things to them. Or it's okay to ask for clarification and for them to give specific examples if applicable to the feedback provided. Learn to read the body language. If they're uncomfortable, they're folding their arms, they're not looking directly at you, they're shifting, uncomfortable in the chairs, maybe it's time to give them an out and say, I want you to think about it more and come back to me tomorrow. I'm going to find you tomorrow and ask for more feedback. It's okay being wrong, relish being wrong. Tell them that this is all about, again, that creating the culture of error. And it's not just one way, it's a two-way street. So it's okay for you to be wrong as well, and say that out loud to them. And last thing I would say is make it clear that you care about the feedback that you're soliciting. Again, show them that you're willing and you're going to make a change. I think one of the third tip I'm going to say is have a go-to question. So there's some quotes from some leaders of some big organizations. Is there anything I could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? I want to ask you a favor. It's a big one, and it is the most important thing you can do for me. Another one is, what's one thing that I could improve? So when you do that, and I think somebody mentioned in the chat, you're asking for coaching with that question, and you assume that there is at least one thing you can work on, and you show that to your learner. And that's, I think somebody said they asked for 2 things that I want to work on. That's amazing. That's perfect. And I think I would say this: adapt or adopt one of these, or whatever may come naturally to you. I will leave you with some open-ended questions that we recommend about soliciting feedback, and there's 3 of them. Use all of them or one of them, or whatever you choose. What would you like to see more of? It's easy and simple to remember. What would you like to see less of? And what do you think could be done differently? And I believe most of you definitely do the last question over here, and some of you are doing all of them or some of them. And to summarize, I would say when you're soliciting feedback, if it's done successfully, it can be a valuable ally of you, the dedicated teacher. You learn to develop your own style, your own questions. You can adapt to the teaching setting and to the individuals being taught. And like I would say, like all other skills that we have acquired over the years in our careers, and we have learned to master, this too can be learned, cultivated, and refined. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Steph to talk about how to process this feedback after you've solicited it.
Great. Thank you so much, Hussein. And thank you to all of the participants. We're getting a lot of responses in the chat, which is always helpful. So yes, now that we've learned how to create the culture of error, we have a welcoming learning environment. We have learned some questions that we can use to better solicit helpful feedback for us. I'm going to talk to you about a framework for how to process said feedback. So we present to you the SHARP framework. Yes, it's another mnemonic, so I apologize, but I do find this one to be really useful. So as you can imagine, and as we've discussed, it can be difficult to process feedback in real time and in person in front of whoever is giving you that feedback, particularly if there are emotions involved or if you feel very passionate about your work, which is all of you, I'm guessing, why you're tuned in on a Thursday afternoon. So I found it helpful just to have this easy mnemonic to rely on when you're in the moment and to provide a little bit of structure for those potentially harried moments. So SHARP stands for soliciting responses, honoring and acknowledging emotions, analyzing feedback, reframing, and planning next steps. So Hussein gave us some great questions to start with here. Find something that feels natural to you and go with it. I really love the suggestions that what's something you want to see more of, less of, and what's one thing I can do differently, especially if I don't have something specific that I want to ask. Maybe I was trying a new strategy and I want to specifically ask them like how that went. But if I don't have anything specific, I can remember these, and that's my go-to. So that works. Don't forget to obtain clarification to show the learner that you're invested. So once you solicit that feedback, probe for a little bit more, because that's where you might find the kernel of truth. It's okay to express surprise. Be sure to thank them. Get curious, not furious. And then we recommend pausing. So that brings us to honoring emotions. So it's important to give yourself time to process what you've just heard. We all work very hard at our jobs, and we owe it to ourselves to acknowledge emotions that have the potential to impede our own growth. So we encourage you to just reflect on how difficult it might have been for the learner to give you, potentially difficult feedback. And allow yourself time to process that, grieve, celebrate, what have you, before moving on to the next step. And I wanted to show this slide again, just because I know, it is a little bit easier when you're dealing in the upper quadrants there, but particularly when it's tough, corrective feedback, you want to give yourself a moment. So step 3 is analyzing the feedback. Once you've honored your emotions, we can actually decide if
2 turkey sandwiches,
something worth
and a
acting.
bunch of pastries.
So remember to ask that oh so helpful probing statement, tell me more. As this can help you to avoid becoming defensive in the moment potentially, and can help uncover an area that could be improved. So for reinforcing comments, is there room to improve things that are going well? Really play up your strengths and avoid becoming stale. For the corrective comments, you can, allow yourself time to decide, is this something worth changing? Can you identify if the problem is related to a personal behavior, or a process within your division, or is it a system-wide issue that might be much more challenging to act on? And then, is there space to create opportunities for your own growth? So one example I like to use here is when I get feedback from my learners that they don't like presenting at the bedside. That is something that I always do, is bedside rounds, and I know it's you know, a bit contentious sometimes for teams. So so if I'm getting this feedback that they don't like it, I hear them out, inquire a bit as to specifically what is it about rounding at the bedside that you don't like. And I do this because, in all honesty, as I've said, I love bedside rounding, and the feedback from patients is consistently reinforcing. So I'm really unlikely to completely blow up the bedside rounding project, but I can be open to some evolution, and am willing to set my emotions aside and change a few things to make it work better for everyone. So really think about where you might see the change. So once you've analyzed the feedback, you're ready to turn threats into opportunities. So again, think about how you might find that kernel of truth in those suggestions and use that to drive your change. So another example that I'll use here, maybe this will resonate with some of you. We're not getting enough teaching. So I feel like I'm constantly teaching throughout rounds, whether we're talking about antibiotic choices or contraindications or side effects, you know, to give one example. But because this is all happening on the go in the world of bedside rounds, my learners don't always appreciate it as formal teaching. So the feedback has often been a request for more didactic style teaching. So of course, my initial reaction is, all right, I feel like we do a lot of this already. And also be careful what you wish for. I don't want to keep you here till 6 p.m. every night. However, after honoring the emotions, I attempted to turn a threat to my teaching into an opportunity. So I started outlining a few of the teaching sessions that I was giving at the bedside each week and turn them into didactics that we do at 9 a.m. So I figured that was a good time. It's before the residents do their interdisciplinary rounding, before formal attending round starts, which gave us about 30 minutes. The content honestly was not that different from what I was already doing previously. But the learners really seemed to appreciate the sit-down didactic, and now this has become a strength in my evaluations. So I do encourage you to really search for that nugget that can help improve not only your evaluations, but more importantly, everyone's experience. So the fifth and final step is planning next steps. So how will you address this feedback? Will you change something? Maybe you've decided you don't want to, or it won't be beneficial, or it would be too challenging. But at least you've thought about it, and hopefully we'll circle back to the learner and explain. The potentially useful suggestions can be incorporated into your teaching on a trial basis. So perhaps this is something that you evaluate the next time you are exchanging feedback to see how things went. It's basically a continuous opportunity for quality improvement. So you might be wondering, what about unsolicited feedback? So just like our learners, we don't always appreciate comments and questions as feedback. So be mindful of the indirect feedback you may be getting during encounters or your teaching sessions. So did your learners ask a lot of questions the last time you gave a talk? Perhaps that's a clue that you can afford to explain things a little bit better next time. Was there eye rolling, or were the learners playing on their phones? That could be a sign that you may want to make your presentation more interactive or engaging. I would say the same rules apply for this unexpected feedback. So remember to keep it sharp. Remember to ask, tell me more, pause, and then think about how you're gonna use that information to improve. So with that, I think we have satisfied our third objective here in discussing the framework. So we wanted to just ask you what questions you may have. We would be remiss if we didn't finish our talk without inquiring of questions and any potential feedback that you may have for us. I'll leave these here for a minute, and we just have some references and our emails, but we'd like to just devote the last 15 minutes or whatever we have for any questions for us.
So I'll take the question about to give feedback to that may not have been directly observed. Well, that is then more about summative feedback, right? Than formative, and you are really limited by how the feedback comes to you. You know, there's two ways that if I'm in an advisory role and I get feedback about my learners. One is the end of the year evaluations, and the other is somebody catches you in the hall and says, "Oh, you know, Susie, she's just terrible. Her presentations are so disorganized," you know, kind of thing. And then what I usually say is, "Tell me more, give me an example." And I even sometimes follow up on the written evaluations. So what do you mean by they're disorganized or whatever? And then that gets to the question system of improving written feedback from faculty. So I think summative feedback and how to give summative feedback, especially when you're not the direct observer, is a whole different topic. But the short answer to it is the better formative feedback you can get, the easier it becomes.
I think there's a question of how do you deal with time limitations when giving feedback in real time? Missy, are you going to take that, or?
I mean, I can, sure. I mean, I'll just tell you how I do. I mean, this comes back to one of the initial comments in the beginning, choosing what you give feedback on. You know, I tend to give my feedback in real time on very specific skill-based things. The summary statement, that history of the present illness didn't give me enough pertinent positives and negatives, you know, and we just do it in real time. I don't give a long harangue about the clinical reasoning mistakes or errors. So you have to be thoughtful about it. But I think in reality, the way I think about it, and this gets a little bit to what Stephanie was talking about, you know, I might even preface it, you know, like when you give feedback, you say, okay, now I'm going to give you feedback. Sometimes I say, this is a great teaching point. And so then it's not just feedback for the learner, it becomes a teaching point. So I frame in my head that it's a twofer for me.
I think there's another comment from Terry. Terry, could you clarify a little bit? You said you get feedback comments that you wear too many hats. You get that is that a criticism?
Well, I think when I ask people, you know, give me two things, you know, that I could do for you as a learner, blah, blah, blah. You know, people don't want to give you real feedback and certainly not negative feedback. So it is not rare for somebody to say, well, no, it's great, blah, 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 blah. But, you know, you have a lot of responsibilities. And I know you can't do anything about that, but sometimes you have to step away and answer a phone call from the CEO or this or that. And of course, that's the reality of life. And I'm never exactly sure to answer that, or, you know, how to rechannel that into really, that's true and also not very helpful. But I'm far from the only one with this issue, so I wondered if people have clues.
I'm trying to think. I think a lot of us here, like you said, probably wear too many hats. I do feel like when sometimes things, sometimes they have a perception that things cannot change and they feel like you can't do anything about it. But I feel like sometimes we can do things about some things and they just have the wrong misconception. So I think if you hear that, if I feel like I was like, actually, no, I can do something about that. So thanks for bringing it to my attention. And I think it encourages them. And I'm sure you do that as well. I think the other thing I was going to say was the two things, and you say, even if you say, give me two things and you still get nothing, I feel like, again, that could be part of the rollout speech and say, I'm going to solicit feedback. And I'm telling you now, I want you to think about it. One thing or two things that I want you to tell me when I'm actually sitting down with a feedback session or whatever, that I want you to tell me that you want me to work on or get better at.
Yeah, what I have found to be most effective there, just for me, is if we really don't come up with anything after I've asked for two specific ones and I've given them a lot of time, I'll say, well, my mother has assured me for my entire life that I am not perfect. So I'd really appreciate it if you would think about this overnight and give me something tomorrow. And usually people will smile and laugh and kind of come back with something.
That's perfect.
I
Terry,
actually love that suggestion.
Add one other thing, Terry, about you're going to get you have leadership positions and you're going to get calls. Put that in your rollout speech, right?
Yep.
Sort of, again, set that expectation, guys. I will do my best to keep my calendar clear, but y'all know that I'm the program director and sometimes things come up, and
Yeah.
I'm sorry that
Good.
that happens. But again, it one, sets expectations, and two, kind of makes it like not worthwhile for them to give you that feedback when you already acknowledged it. So kind of taking the wind out of their sails a little bit.
Good reminder. Thank you.
Yeah, I do love that suggestion. And just to add and reiterate what you said, Hussein, that I think a lot of times our learners do assume that things can't change.
Right.
So just reinforcing, like, perhaps there is something that can be done about that. It might not look like what you think it, should look like, but we can move the needle a little bit.
Right. I think Ravi made another good suggestion, like asking the learners if they feeling frustrated with something, sounds like a system issue or something, asking that question, how did that impact the learning environment? I think it does a couple of things that actually sometimes people, if they're complaining just for the sake of complaining, is like, is it actually impacting you in any meaningful way, or is it just something that's just not fun for you right now kind of thing? So it actually maybe have them do some introspection as well.
And again, I think also just remembering how important it is to really ask yourself, is this something worth changing? You may decide like that maybe there is nothing that can be done about it, or maybe it didn't impact the learning environment. And like you said, it's just not their preference, or they're just, able to emote, which is fine, but maybe there's nothing that you need to change.
We did not get any feedback on our.
I was going to say, Hussein, can we take the last 5 minutes, guys, and really ask for things that you liked, things that, and you don't have to answer all three, just answer one of the three questions. Things that you liked, things that we could have done differently, anything that you would have liked to have seen us do that we didn't do. It would be really helpful to us as we think about maybe giving this talk in another session. 3 objectives. Okay.
And honestly, we would love to hear from you. So if you, I can put up the emails again at the end, but feel free to message us as well.
Thank you.
Questions as prompts. Okay, great. Thank you.
Role play. We did play around with that idea.
Yes, we did. We were worried a little bit about time. Oh, glad you didn't do a role play. Yeah. I always figure we're doing it just right if I get feedback on both sides of the question.